the wider perception is that things are getting better in Kashmir. What does that mean that we still have, say, Srinagar do 38% as opposed to about 50?
There is a distrust between the people who live there and what decisions are being made on their behalf in Delhi.
This time round, the uprising from the ground seems to be this is now a weapon or at least a tool to voice your own point of view.
Hi, welcome to episode 16 of the India Dialogue. We're so grateful that you are giving us a listen. My name is Ruchir. I'm, as always, joined by Mitali and Manu, my co hosts. Mitali is the Director of Journalism at the Reuters Institute and is an author of a book called Crypto Crimes. By the way, I've ordered a copy. I'm waiting for mine. And Manu is an advocate, a lawyer with his own law practice in Chennai, and he's a spokesperson for DMK. I'm Ruchir. I'm the CEO at Distributed Energy and the chair at School of Policy and Governance. As always, we unpack issues and current affairs from India. We are in the middle of our elections right now. Phase 4 just finished. We like to focus on issues that matter and try and go deep in a few topics every week. This week, we have the elections that we are thinking about, phase 3 and or phase 4, and what's transpired, as well as a few journalists and activists who've just received bail. Mitali, you want to take us through the first topic?
Yeah, thanks, Ruchir. So much of our chat and conversations over the last few weeks have been about the elections. So at this point, we're kind of beyond the halfway mark. The fourth phase had, I think, about 96 seats that went to poll. It was also really interesting because it was the first time, or at least it was the first round for Kashmir going to vote as well. So there was voting in the valley area. There's a lot of hectic campaigning happening in Uttar Pradesh. You know, Priyanka Gandhi is on the ground, Narendra Modi, of course. Rahul Gandhi has been talking again about protecting democratic rights, talking a bit about the constitution. And you also have with it, because we sort of touched upon it a little bit last time, you have the Chief Minister of Delhi, Arvind Kejriwal, who's out now on bail and is also campaigning in a very, very hectic fashion, essentially saying, this is the time for all of us to fight back against what he calls, you know, a dictatorial regime, and they should be voted out. So I I sense, at least from the news flow, there is a little bit of exhaustion in what we talked about right at the start of this being a really, really long phase of elections, but it's still sort of rolling along. So let me start with asking you both what your highlights were, and then we can pick up maybe a specific nugget within that election chat. Manu, you want to go first?
Sure. I think last time we spoke about briefly the sort of how the gauntlet has been, thrown down. There has been a call and an invitation for the major political leaders, so Mr. Narendra Modi and Mr. Rahul Gandhi, to engage in a presidential style debate. We've seen since then Rahul Gandhi accepting. It's been a week and we have not yet heard from the BJP. In fact, I think what we discussed last time is sort of what has been happening. BJP sort of saying no without saying no. They've, I think, asked Smriti Irani to step up and invite Rahul Gandhi to debate her. But the debate that we are all looking forward to hasn't yet happened. Since last week, I think something interesting that caught my eye in the news was that about a day or two ago, the Home Secretary, the Union Home Secretary, has issued citizenship to a number of people under the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, which was in the news and it was in court for a very long time. Now, very interestingly, for about 4.5 years, or nearly 4.5 years, the government had not done very much with the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act. But just before we went to elections, they notified the rules. And after which, there is, of course, a number of cases pending challenging the validity of the act itself. but the Supreme Court has not had time to hear the matter and has now pushed it to the second half of the year. So when the Supreme Court resumes after vacation in July, this being the case, and I think again, like how we saw last week, or a little over a week ago, how the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council had put out a very convenient report on population of different communities. I wonder whether this sort of citizenship handing out ceremony by the Home Secretary, nevertheless, because the government and cannot act through its ministers at the moment because of the Model Code of Conduct, whether that sort of is to tap into. So my prediction for this week, and looking back at last week, is that going forward there might be some debate or discourse around Citizenship Amendment Act, and how people have now started being started benefiting from the policies of the government, right? So that is one. And of course the second part is that we've, as you've said, we've noted that about three out of the five sort of Kashmir seats have gone to election, and we noted that Srinagar turned around 38 or 36% voting in its, which according to some of you, it's a high number, because traditionally Kashmir particularly, and Srinagar even more so, has only voted around 15 or 16%. But nevertheless, I mean, the question is whether this election, which is the first election after the 2019 Article 370 abrogation, and of course the Supreme Court judgment, which came a little earlier this year, and after the state of Jammu and Kashmir itself has been sort of bifurcated and converted into a union territory, and union territory where there has been no election per se. So whether the people of Jammu and Kashmir especially will show their sort of support or their anger towards these policies of the union government through vote, and whether that will sort of, has that increased the percentage, or is the narrative of the union government, which says that, by making taking these very essential steps, they have in fact made Jammu and Kashmir a more safer place, a place where people can come out and exercise their democratic right and so on. This will be the sort of, I guess, argument, or this will be what we need to look out for from this particular part of it. Just a couple of points, I think, if you want us to sort of go into Article 370, but let me wait until I hear from Ruchir as well before we go and sort of unpack Article 370 a little bit, and the Supreme Court judgment, which may sort of, I think, add some context for what is happening in present day Kashmir.
Richard, what have you been tracking?
I think obviously all of us heard the Prime Minister talk about how he doesn't do Hindu Muslim because that would be beneath him. Obviously, the challenge in the current environment is that there is so much communal comments from across the board, and we've heard it through the last few weeks. We've unpacked them here on the show. So it's not quite accurate, and I wonder what the change in stance is for. But on I really want to unpack the Article 370 piece. The thing I'm like a little bit impatient about is what does the verdict look like of the turnout that was, just to understand what the people of Kashmir think about Article 370. So that would be really interesting to unpack. Thinking about this, just when I was reading about the turnout numbers, historically I learned that turnout has always been low in Kashmir. Even though in the rest of the country we see numbers in the, at least in the second half, as in higher than 50%. Kashmir has historically been low for a range of reasons. Um, Historically, it used to be around security so often, and obviously boycotts around relationship with India, or thinking about the government of the day. But I'm curious, even now, when the wider perception is that things are getting better in Kashmir. what does that mean that we still have, say, Srinagar do 38% as opposed to about 50? So I'm curious to find out what that looks like, and I'm especially curious about the verdict because I want to understand how they perceive
Yeah,
the abrogation.
yeah, lots to unpack with the Article 370 conversation. I just wanted to say, though, quickly in terms of, what I've been tracking, I guess, two things come to mind. One, that this time round, my sense is there is a lot more global attention on the Indian elections. In the past, at least in 2019, it was sort of a conversation around, it's a strong leader. India is a country of potential. Let's see where this goes. Overwhelming majority in terms of the mandate that he got, and it kind of got, the page was turned there. This time, I see far more consistent and perhaps critical, conversations around what's happening in India, and what I think, not just what are the lessons, but what are the repercussions for the world if there is indeed sort of, damage or threat to the democratic structure of a country like India, where you're talking about 1 billion people. What the elements of that look like, what the elements of the communal narrative look like, and what the world should be looking at more carefully. So I think it's a bit less about this one's done and dusted. Let's move on. There's a lot more analysis that's happening on a pretty consistent basis. The other one I think that's important to just highlight, Ruchir, and this is not about one leader, but I think it's about questioning when we talk about misinformation and misleading information, and hateful content. We often sort of point to this and that, and we say, oh, social media is the problem, and all these WhatsApp messages are the problem. But I think you have to sort of also acknowledge that the largest part of the problem is when people in positions of authority make those comments. So some of the few newspapers that have tracked this, I was just looking at the timeline. On the 14th of May, the Prime Minister said, the day I start doing Hindu Muslim, I won't be fit to live in public life. On the 3rd of May, he had said they, which is the opposition, are asking Muslims to do vote jihad, because we've heard about love jihad and land jihad. I hope you all know, what the meaning of jihad is, and, whom it is being waged against. He then made the comment on the 14th of May, as I said. On the 15th of May, the next day, at a rally in Maharashtra, the Prime Minister said Congress wanted to give 15% of the entire budget to Muslims, but they didn't succeed because of the BJP's opposition. It's not only false, it is also misleading, it is also harmful. So I think this time round, a lot of the commentary is being documented real time, and we're seeing. Where exactly we land on the Hindu Muslim conversation. Of course, if you go back in time, 2017, 19, etc., you'll find more. But let me switch to Jammu Kashmir, and before I get Manu's thoughts in, I think it's extremely important, Ruchir. I was also looking at the turnout figures, and this 38% figure is the last time they saw voting percentages like this was in 1989. Just to give people a sense of the fact that voting percentages are generally quite low, if, as you said, either by way of security or almost by way of protest. And this time round, the uprising from the ground seems to be, this is now a weapon, or at least a tool, to voice your own point of view, or to have someone accurately speak for you. That seems to be the tone and tenor of what people being interviewed across Jammu Kashmir are talking about. It's also a bit counterintuitive that a party that's seen as so aggressive as the BJP is choosing not to contest this time. I think one of the party spokespersons made a comment saying, we are here to win hearts and minds first, which doesn't really sit with the strategy for the BJP. And interestingly, some of the key parties that are contesting, of course, this time round are the National Conference, but the Home Minister is conducting, I think, starting today, a 2 day apolitical visit to the valley. And some of the concerns are that they may be speaking with smaller parties. I think there are parties like the People's Conference, of course, but something called the Kashmir Apni Party as well. And whether or not in the background they're trying to construct something that might look like a combination, if if these parties were to get enough of a vote. But let's start with the main point, which is that since 2019, which is when Article 370 was introduced, this is the first time the Valley is going to vote. Manu, it would be useful for people listening to just have some context around that particular event first.
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify. So, since 2019, this is when Article 370 was abrogated. Now, there has also been some level of local body elections, which I believe have happened. So again, I think the results of those were overwhelmingly in favor of the national conference. I can double check, but of course, um, so 2019, BJP comes back with a majority with a clear mandate for another 5 years. And in August, sort of unannounced or sort of without much sort of warning in that sense, while the parliament session was ongoing, I think it was on the 4th of or 5th of August 2019, the BJP did two things. It's very important to understand. First is they imposed president's rule. So they dissolved the elected state legislature, which at that point was a alliance of the PDP and the National Conference. Now they did that, and soon thereafter, that day or the very next day, they introduced the bills to um, change the Jammu and Kashmir state into two union territories. Now that's very important to understand, because the one part, taking away the power of the legislature by dissolving it and giving that power to the president, and the second part is to conversion, bifurcation, and the conversion into from statehood to union territory. Now you may wonder whether this is just a formality, right? Because why would they need to do this? There are two reasons for it. One, Article 3 of the Constitution says whenever there is a change done, a conversion or any change to the statehood, then the legislature of that state must be heard. So the legislature must either be heard through a resolution or a bill or some such. Now, when by not having a legislature at the point of time to convert the state into a union territory, and just by going by the governor and the president's views, they've essentially, in a sense, taken away the voices of people who lived in Jammu and Kashmir, firstly, and replaced it with, simply speaking, the view or the opinion of the governor and the president. But before we get into that 370, let's sort of understand also, just to contextualize, why is Kashmir an issue, right? If you go back and understand or trace the history of Kashmir, and you compare it with the other, sort of princely states that sort of merged with India, Kashmir had this interesting quality. It was a Muslim majority state by population, but had a Hindu ruler at that particular point of time. So there were certain concessions given to Kashmir in return for Kashmir uh, merging as part of the Indian Union. Now, these are what sort of made Kashmir a little special. Now, of course, I know I'm oversimplifying this, but the Bharatiya Janata Party has always had a problem with the fact that a Muslim majority state, a populous state, had actually certain concessions which made it, unique to the rest of the states or the rest of the country. So it has been their stated position, it has been in their manifesto that they want to abrogate Article 370 and make Jammu and Kashmir a part of the rest of the country. But what we didn't sort of expect in August 2019 was, not only did they do that, but as a further measure, they took away the state assembly, which helped them do this. And secondly, also converted the state into union territories and bifurcated. Now, the really sad and tragic part of this entire saga is that twofold. One is, after this, sort of happened in the parliament and got the president's assent, cases came to be filed challenging this entire sort of act of the union government and the parliament. Now, these cases took about 4 years to get finally resolved, which is an inordinate time given that for 4 years, the people who lived in Jammu and Kashmir had no, state assembly, right? And no legislative assembly, no elections to the state, and so on. Now, finally, when it came and finally it was sort of resolved, the Supreme Court specifically said, and it posed a question to the Union of India saying, what is your position with regard to statehood? And this is recorded in the order of the Supreme Court, especially in paras 503 and 504 of the judgment. And this is the judgment. There were three judgments, one authored by the Chief Justice of India, and this in that it is recorded that they have recorded the oral submission of the Solicitor General of Union of India that the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir would be restored. So, in fact, by just recording an oral submission, the Supreme Court did not even go into the question whether the conversion of a state into two union territories or a state to a union territory itself per se was fair, constitutionally just and valid, and so on, which is, according to me, extremely problematic, not just for Kashmir, but for all states, because tomorrow, armed with this judgment, and if a party comes back with a brutal majority, a party like the Bharatiya Janata Party, it pretty much gives them a carte blanche to go ahead and dissolve as elected state government, impose president's rule, and bifurcate a state into any number of parts, which, to just put it very simply, goes against the very grain of federal thought. People should have their own sort of elections for their municipalities, their corporations, their states, and then the parliament. Now, if we leave it to the parliament or the party in power in parliament to take these decisions with regard to states, and essentially the essential character of a state, whether it should be a state, whether it should be a union territory, I think that is deeply problematic and goes completely against the ethos. And in fact, when I wrote for Hindustan Times earlier this year, I specifically wrote that Baba Sahib Ambedkar, when speaking in the Constituent Assembly, he specifically says, and I quote, "The states under our constitution are in no way dependent upon the center for their legislative or executive authority. The center and the states are co-equal in this matter." This is pretty much the words of Baba Sahib Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly debate. And the sad part is this is actually quoted in the judgment, but of course not given effect to. So, long story short, I think Article 370, according to me, is not a problem only for Kashmir. Every state should be worried, concerned, deeply disturbed by it. But more so, I think Kashmir, they have lived through the last 5 years without an elected government. They've lived through under president's rule. The fact that there's been uh, below 15-20% voter turnout in the last 30 years shows this level of deep sort of distrust also with the union and its policies, right? And it's not just limited to one political party. There is a distrust between the people who live there and what decisions are being made on their behalf in Delhi. And I think, something like this, I can't see how it would have improved that trust deficit in any way. We need to wait to see what happens. And the sort of the ironic and funny thing, if this wasn't tragic, is this, right? The union government in its wisdom, and of course the Election Commission of India in its wisdom, thought that it is okay for Kashmiris to vote for their parliamentarian, but not to vote for their legislative assembly. The like I said, it's really dark humor, for me to go vote for my MP when I do not have my own MLA. And I think that's really the problem. And I'll just quote Abhishek Manu Singhvi. he uses this phrase which I really like. He says federalism is like a pressure valve. You know, you need bigger countries, bigger organizations need to be more decentralized or more federal, because that means the problems are sorted at the lowest level. They don't bubble up right to the top. And I think Kashmiris have always had this huge problem with how the Indian nation state has, looked after them or looked out for them. And I think such an anti-federal move is like the worst antidote to these sort of issues that have plagued our country and the state of Kashmir over the last like 40-50 years, if not longer. But like I said, I think that's my sort of take on 370, very federal focused. But I'd love to hear what you guys have to think. What
No,
you?
and I think it's so important to have this legal perspective, Manu. You're absolutely right. We're discussing this from a prism of the last 10 years, but to be honest, it's a state that has been hemorrhaging forever. And I say this as a former sort of defense officer's daughter. I know how emotive Kashmir can be as an issue for a lot of the armed forces. It's almost no go territory. It's something they will not discuss, and it's not open for sort of dialogue, which is quite painful to see, but must be even more painful to live through. Ruchir, let me draw you in, because that's the thing, right? As Manu pointed out, it was part of the manifesto, so it was obviously feeding off a certain level of public approval or public support.
I have an observation. I have an answer to you, Mitali, and then I have a question. So the observation is this: that I think you're right. I think our organization at the grassroots seems so much worse than our organization as we go further up. I think that is a really good insight, and perhaps something that is worthy of a discussion in a future episode, where we should think about how we think about municipalities versus district versus state legislatures versus federal government. And I think you're right. I think that is a loss, in that they don't have a state legislator or local organization. Um, the question around loss of um, representation, the one thing on my mind is I want to see the verdict. I think the fact that there is a higher turnout, I want to see what that actually means. Is it a signal for people saying we like this or not? I am really curious, especially around the economic growth in the last few years. At least the reports are that they've more than doubled their state GDP. The per capita GDP is increased by, I think, 40 or 50% in the last few years. Um, we have heard of less security incidents on the border. So a lot of I'm not sure about the human rights issues, but just a lot of the economic indicators are quite positive. And is that a sign of the idea that we moved away from this special situation with JNK to us just focusing on bringing Kashmir as part of the wider India story? The one question I do have is, or perhaps it's a counterpoint to what you're saying, Manu, around every state should be worried. Wasn't this a special case because there was a special situation with Kashmir, that Article 370 was written for them, and other states don't really have to worry about it? So I guess that's a question or a counterpoint. Like, other states shouldn't worry because this was the situation with Kashmir, and it was only addressed for Kashmir.
So the reason for my concern is that the Supreme Court does not see it like that. Firstly, it endorses the move by the union to first impose president's rule, right? At that particular point, on the 4th, 3rd, 2nd of August, 1st of August 2019, there was no serious security situation or breakdown in law and order, or as they call it, the breakdown in constitutional machinery, that warranted president's rule. In fact, if you recall, about 8 months prior to that, there was a PDP BJP coalition government there. In fact, things were fine and dandy as long as the BJP was part of the state government, the alliance government there, with Mehbooba Mufti, I think, leading the alliance there. But of course, subsequently, once sort of the sand shifted and the alliance changed there, things, suddenly picked up in that sense. And of course, soon after the parliament elections in 2019, I presume that this plan was put into action anyway. Now, like I said, there are two parts of this. One is abrogating or doing away with the special situation or special concession or permission given, right, which was sort of tied in with the deal or arrangement of the state of Kashmir joining the Union of India, right? The second part is how it has been done, right? Now, that is what I mean, that is my worry with the judgment also, which is that it does not recognize that this happened in a very underhanded manner, by first dismissing the union, by dismissing the state government and replacing the state legislature with the president. So this was done specifically to circumvent or short circuit the requirement in Article 3 of the Constitution, which says you have to hear the state legislature. Now, by endorsing this particular modus operandi, I feel that's the problem that the Supreme Court has failed to recognize. That tomorrow, any union government which has a state that they want bifurcated, right? And there are some states, and especially this is true in the south, where the BJP finds it very hard to sort of make inroads. So for them, bifurcating a state would not actually, be a huge loss in any sense, but it may help consolidate one part of the state for whatever reason. So my concern is more along those lines. And typically, what we call in law as what we call is a colorable exercise of power, which is that when a particular act or an action is vitiated through some sort of malice, so when it's done in a way that is not correct, so the original intent needs to be seen. So why did they first bring in the president's rule and then abrogate Article 370? Why not have a referendum for the people of Jammu and Kashmir? If at any stage over the last 10 or 20 or 30 years, they could have exercised that power and made it an issue that the people of Jammu and Kashmir could have voted in favor of or against, and then used that. I mean, that would have been a better route than to sort of just ask the governor and president's opinion on whether we can do away with a special concession given to an entire state, which, whether you like it or not, has been sort of infused into the constitution. So my concern more goes back to how the original intent was exercised by the BJP government in the union.
Ruchir, I just want to make a quick point that you raised about the economic conditions of Jammu and Kashmir, because I'm not sure whether that's, sort of widely known. So in December 2019, shortly after the abrogation, the Kashmir Chamber of Commerce and Industry actually put out some data in terms of the economic loss since the dilution of Article 370. And those numbers pitted it at sort of sector wise analysis of the 10 districts showed that the losses stood at over 17,500 crores. Now, in terms of the economics, part of what was cited as one reason for doing this was that non residents could purchase land. The numbers from total investment in 21-22 in Jammu Kashmir was at $46 million. That was down from the $50 million from the previous year. But if you compared it to 2017 and 18, it was less than half, where the figure was over $100 million. I think what people tend to sometimes equate Jammu and Kashmir with, because of the level of violence it's gone with, is very poor economic conditions. But actually, compared to some of the poor states, and even against other benchmarks, Jammu and Kashmir has been economically doing pretty well. The education levels are actually far higher than they are in many other states in northern India. And this is a bit of a misnomer that there has been attendant sort of economic damage, and that abrogation of Article 370 has actually caused much more economic growth. The numbers don't show it out. We don't have enough updated data right up to 24, but I'm just sharing some of the figures of how trends moved from there on. And even on that basis, the last few figures, I think, but maybe I shouldn't mention this because I don't have the hard data compared to Gujarat. Even on that basis, Jammu and Kashmir was still holding up better. And people have pointed out that, we really need to rethink these models of economic development that we're talking about.
And just going by sort of, I guess, very sort of I guess conventional thinking, whenever you need to sort of bring in economic growth, and you sort of bring in the big industries to drive that growth through employment, you want to sort of feel, as an industry leader, you want to feel very comfortable with the local political setup, right? You need to have that sort of comfort level. I mean, because you may get, when you're coming from overseas, you may get the international, national sort of licenses and permissions to come in, but ultimately the local leadership, the local sort of infrastructure, access to ports or airports, or availability of skilled semi-skilled labor, electricity, so on and so forth. All of this will take 15, 20 years of very sort of planned strategic development. So I doubt if we'll even have any numbers after 5 years. And just going back to what was said before the Supreme Court, if they're going to restore the statehood, those are the words of the Solicitor General, on record, as I said in paras 503, 504 of the judgment. If they're going to restore the statehood, then what is the point of the last 5 years? Like, what was the thinking? Why was it converted to into two union territories? Right? It just does not make sense at all. This cannot be just something that you do because one fine day you thought this would be a better model. If you have a long term vision, we haven't heard it from the home minister, we haven't heard it from the prime minister, we haven't heard it from the BJP spokespersons that union territory is better off than a state. So then, if that's the case, then we should make all states union territories so they're better administered, right? So that's not their argument itself. So we haven't quite heard. And last point is, again, circling back on Kashmir, is I mean, we won't know whether people have voted for reason A, reason B, are they upset with person X, person Y. But I can say one thing, which is that Article 370 is not an economic issue, it is a deeply identity related issue. So I think, usually what I've understood in politics is when there is no identity related issue, then, you look at economics, people are happy, people are dissatisfied with certain development growth, etc. But when there are identity issues, usually, more often than not, they trump all other economic issues, right? So I think that is the reason why people are sort of excited or tracking this particular jump, or doubling of the voting percentage in Srinagar particularly, and they're watching this very closely, whether this is the sort of uh, second verdict after the Supreme Court on Article 370.
Manu, I want to pick that point. I think we should move on to the next issue, but I think that point is really important. Sometimes this whole identity versus economics, don't you think that's a lot about the fact that either increased inequality or low amount of income increases the discussion around identity to begin with? I find that if you have um, good economic growth for people and it's not unequal, then communal issues, identity issues, all the like these political hotbeds reduce. So shouldn't economics be an incentive to address some of these concerns?
So I think the discussion, it's a really interesting sort of I guess discourse. But I think this particular discourse, Ruchir, assumes that uh, identity issues are inversely proportional to economic growth, right? So, but that may not be the
I
case.
think I think specifically economic inequality. That's where
Economic
I
inequality also. So saying where countries where there is no economic inequality, or less economic inequality, identity issues are much less apparent, or come to the fore much less. I don't know. I don't know if you can take for a simple sort of easy to understand example like the United States of America, or France, or the United Kingdom jurisdictions I'm a little familiar with, where economic inequality is perhaps less pronounced compared to India, but there are still identity based issues. I mean, the United States, certainly, at least, we know for a fact that race still plays a huge part of their campaigns. Perhaps in other jurisdictions, religion plays a significant part, so on and so forth. So identity is very interesting. I don't think a person's identity or a community identity is diluted only because of economic factors, right? Let me put it again back in the Indian context. It is to say, in the better off families, or economically well-to-do families in India, there's less caste identity markers or caste identity thoughts, right? Which is not the case. There is no data to show that economically advanced Indian families are less caste conscious or community conscious, right? And I don't know if I don't think that's the case even in terms of religion or religious sort of identity. So coming back, I don't think it's that simplistic. I don't think if you just push the economic engine along, people are better off. Then the identity part of the politics necessarily goes down, right? It may play out in other ways, is what I'm saying. But here, like I said, the identity issue is more linked to how they are perceived. Kashmiris, citizens of Kashmir, residents of Kashmir, are perceived by Delhi, by the decision makers in Delhi, how they are being treated. And a very loose analogy is like, say, the state of Tamil Nadu, for example. There's always this huge um, trust deficit between Tamil Nadu and Delhi, right? And that is exacerbated by the linguistic difference. But here you have linguistic difference, one, religious difference, two, in Kashmir, and thirdly, the security aspect also, right? How Kashmir is sensitive and needs a greater level of sort of security considerations than any other or most other states in India. So again, on all these aspects, I don't know if just economic advancement would completely dissolve or dilute identity based politics. And I also don't believe identity based sort of thinking and politics is necessarily bad. Of course, I don't think it should come at the expense of good socioeconomics and good sort of empirical based or evidence based economic policy making. But I don't think that has been particularly the case. I think this is a case where Kashmiris do not trust Delhi decision makers enough, and I think that will continue. And I don't think the abrogation of Article 370 has in any way helped reduce that deficit in that sense. Should we move on to
Let's
the
do it.
next topic? I think we've spent a bit of time. So, are we throwing this to back to Ruchir to take us to the
I,
next?
I'll talk about another story that's developed this week. Gautam Navlakha was arrested in connection with a Maoist-linked case. He was initially arrested in August 2018 and placed under house arrest in November 2022. On the 14th of May this week, the Supreme Court vacated the stay on his bail, which was granted by the Bombay High Court in December 23. In a parallel case, Prabir Pulkayastha was arrested on October 3 last year. The arrest was in relation to allegations of receiving illegal funding from Chinese firms. The Supreme Court on 15th of May declared his arrest and remand illegal. They're both arrests that were made in relation to the Unlawful Activities Act. Manu, do you want to unpack the legal aspects of this? And Mitali, I'd love to then hear about sort of what does it actually imply. Yeah.
Yeah, let me actually maybe start with some of the legal aspects, and then I think Mitali should definitely tell us a bit about the state of activism and journalism. But I think the common thread is going to be, I think, that of authoritarian excesses, right, and abuse of power, which is something that whether you're an activist or a journalist, is something that you must be very, very seriously worried about. And this has been further, I guess, made is more problematic because of the laws that are in place. Two particular laws, as you said. One is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the UAPA, and the second is the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. The problem with both these laws are almost, and this goes against what you learn in first or second year of law school or college in India, which is that what we are taught in criminal law is that you are innocent until proven guilty. But these two laws specifically invert the entire jurisprudence to almost as if to say, and these are not my words, these are the words of Justice Dr. S. Muralidhar, who was the Chief Justice of the Odisha High Court till recently. It is guilty until you prove that you are innocent in trial, right? Because no other Western civilized society that is based on the rule of law actually allows for pre-trial arrest to the extent that we do under these two laws. We've discussed this under the context of the enforcement directorate and usually in PMLA, because that is the sort of agency which has put away a lot of opponents or political opponents in jail for extended periods of time, including Arvind Kejriwal till very recently. But the UAPA is being used very, very in equal measure, very calculatedly against activists, people with so-called Maoist links, people who had Maoist literature, people who had sort of come into contact with banned organizations, people who had books circulated by banned organizations, and so on and so forth. Right now, I think the case of Gautam Navlaka is very interesting, and I really sort of I was hoping that would set off a new wave of thinking in terms of bail jurisprudence. He is one of the first people, and probably one of the few people that I know who was released on bail, but under like a house arrest. He was kept in house arrest for a long time, which is, according to me, a great alternative to arrest and prison, imprisonment, when you are an under trial prisoner, right? Because one of the biggest problems we have in our prisons is overcrowding, and like I said, any basic bail jurisprudence in a globe in a civilized society should say that until you complete trial you should not really be in jail, but you can be in bail and you can be kept in watch, and so on and so forth. So Gautam Navlaka was actually put under house arrest in Mumbai, and of course kept under watch and so on. Now, that and a series of other orders which was challenged before the Supreme Court, and interestingly, the Supreme Court initially stayed that order for a reason which was not very clear, but has now come to sort of by its own self remove that stay and say that the original bail orders are good and can be implemented, right? So again, this is Supreme Court speaking in multiple voices. But let be that as it may, uh, Prabir Kayasta's case was much more interesting because he ran a news website and was identified as a journalist, and they sort of arrested him. Now, again, this is something very interesting, and this goes to tell you how the ED and the union sort of law enforcement agencies are functioning. He was arrested, and not according to the judgment that came out a couple of days ago, he was not even informed why he was arrested. What is called the grounds of arrest was not produced to him, right? And the Supreme Court, again, this is the sad part. It has taken the Supreme Court now what, 2 plus another 5 7 months or 8 months to come to this finding, which could have happened in probably 4 weeks, 6 weeks, right? And unfortunately, this person has had to be in behind bars for 8 months. Supreme Court has come to a finding that it is not constitutional and it is unfair that a person who is being remanded, arrested, is not even given, supplied a copy of the grounds of arrest, saying, why are you being arrested? These are the reasons. So, this is the unfortunate sort of place where we are. And again, I say this with sort of the greatest sort of caution, knowing what I'm saying, that the Supreme Court now has to do the work of what a magistrate should be doing. The magistrate is the person to whom the law enforcement agency or the police take the person they have arrested and tell the magistrate to formalize the arrest by passing a remand order. Now, the sad part is in Prabir's case and in many other cases, the magistrates mechanically just, you know, approve the remand prayer, the remand petition filed by the prosecuting agency, which goes to the High Court then. High Court, in 9 out of 10 cases, Navlaka was one of the rare cases where they actually sort of gave him bail and house arrest. But most of the cases that is confirmed. And finally, it has to now come to the Supreme Court, which is the court of last resort, the highest court in the country. And to be fair, not everybody can make it to the Supreme Court. Now, of course, if you have a base in Delhi, and this is a great sort of research done by some scholars, including Nick Robinson, an American scholar, and others, and this is published in uh, many publications, including the Frontline magazine, about 10 years ago, which said that most cases that come to the Supreme Court are from Delhi or Punjab or Uttar Pradesh high courts. So, meaning those three adjacent states, right? So, if you are from the far off states, you won't even make it to the Supreme Court. So the reason I'm saying that is twofold. One is that a lot of people don't even make it as far as Prabir, Purkayasta, or Gautam Navlaka. Don't have the wherewithal to, and many of them, like Umar Khalid, or I forget the Kerala journalist who was arrested on his way to Uttar Pradesh, right? So all of them are not even their cases are not even heard. And it's sad that the Supreme Court has to do this when actually it should be dealing with more important constitutional matters. Again, linking this back to Article 370, it took the Supreme Court 4.5 years to deal with Article 370, right? Why? Because it is clogged by bail applications, which should not be dealt with at this level. So that's my sort of rant on these two cases. But again, maybe I'll just push this off to Mitali to deal with the state as you see it of what is happening across the world, or even in India.
Entirely, can I add a layer of question on that, which is like, how do you think about balancing sort of this, like this idea of legitimate dissent versus national security, or how the government sort of presents it under UAPA, for example?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think Manu has sort of outlined the Gautam Navlakha case so well, and I won't get into that. I'll just speak briefly about Prabir Purkayastha and maybe an added layer to that. One is, as Manu pointed out, the grounds of arrest were not provided. But I think what's a bit worrisome is the fact that this time round the court seems to indicate that, if the correct procedure is followed this time round, the police can still do it. So he's out on bail, but it looks like he has a separate fight. And I'm not sure how many people know the story about Prabir, but all those years back when India was under emergency, Prabir was a young student, and in his own words, he wrote he was sort of protesting, I think, on the lawns of the School of Languages, and someone came up to him who was obviously a police officer, asked him, what he was doing there, why he was protesting, etc. And then he and his men basically picked Prabir up, and then he was kept in jail for a year. And at that time, it was under the maintenance of internal security, the MISA. So this sort of this the journalists like Prabir have constantly spoken out against what they see is wrong, and have also paid the cost for it in terms of being jailed. So it wasn't the first time for Prabir. And on your point about dissent, I think It's really difficult to draw that line, Ruchir, where you, I mean, first of all, with Prabir's case, it was such a flimsy case to start off with, based on a New York Times article that seemed to make some oblique reference to, getting funding from China, which itself, was, it was literally in two separate parts in the article, that they talked about a particular investor, and then they talked about some articles that NewsClick had run. When people went through the articles and the content that NewsClick was actually presenting, it turned out to be really banal videos that talked about, what is the Chinese model of governance and how does it work over there. There really was nothing anti-national in it. So first of all, I think that term needs to be separated from, the way it quickly gets linked with journalism or with critical journalism. And for Prabir, it's not the first time, so this is not even something that you can color and say, oh, this person is anti BJP, or he's anti a particular party, because he's been through this before, and that was in the time of the Congress. I think what struck me was two things. One, the note that the court put out, and I'm just quoting from there, where they write, apparently this entire exercise was done in a clandestine manner and was nothing but a blatant attempt to circumvent the due process of law, to confine the accused to police custody without informing him the grounds on which he had been arrested. The accused, having engaged an advocate to defend himself, there was no rhyme or reason as to why information about the proposed remand application was not sent in advance to the advocate engaged by the appellant. I don't know, but I hope this proves to be a critical turning point for not just Prabir, but many journalists and civil society leaders who are, as Manu pointed out, currently jailed, and don't even get the chance to for a hearing. Forget about sort of going through procedure. They just keep seeing delays and postponements in terms of a bail hearing. So I'm hopeful that for Prabir, this is something where he does not see himself getting arrested again very shortly. And I hope this also sets the precedent for other journalists and other civil society voices that are currently in jail. The other thing I'll say briefly, and it would be interesting to hear from both of you, is that there's one sort of trend I saw. It's more apparent on social media, but it must be a point of discussion in person as well. Ever since the Arvind Kejriwal bail release happened, is this constant narrative on platforms saying it's time to, if this government comes back, they need to fix the judiciary. And they talk about this in loose terms as judicial reforms, but I think what they're really talking about is executive control over or greater executive control over the judiciary. And I just wonder how damaging this is to the fabric of what all of us as ordinary citizens see as due process of law, or what all of us see as, honestly, a safety net. Right? What do you do when you feel wronged? You turn towards legal remedy, and you turn towards, hopefully, legal support to defend you and to defend your rights as a citizen. When you start having this kind of loose and frankly quite dangerous talk about how coming back to power, the government should now fix the judiciary, I think it's really, really damaging for a society. And I'd love to hear from both, you, Manu, and from Ruchir as well, on what that can do to the psyche of a society.
Go ahead, Manu. Yeah, no, I mean, Manu, my question is more around like the magistrate point you made is very interesting. Why doesn't the legal system move faster through some of these things? I mean, part of the scary part is that you can be in the process for years and years and years. Um, what stops? Is it just we need more justices at every level? What is the barrier to these things moving so slowly?
So yeah, there is a lot of clogging, most certainly, and that does sort of slow down the system. But I don't think it's just that problem alone, right? The problem is that um, enough we don't empower the lowest level of judiciary. When I say lowest level, I mean the at the district level, at the trial court level. We don't empower them enough that they take strong decisions and solid decisions, right? And I think that is a problem. A lot of the judgments written at the level of the district courts or the trial courts are often turned in appeal, right? Which is not a good sign, which says that there's a lot of mistakes that are being done at the lowest level. So that needs to change, firstly. Secondly, at all levels, courts are becoming what I would call executive or pro-executive courts, right? Like pro-government courts. They hardly go against the version of the prosecution or the version of the police or the enforcement directorate or the CBI, which results in a lot of unnecessary sort of appeals, and then it gets sorted out at the highest level in the Supreme Court or something like that. And I think thirdly, also the problem is the Supreme Court in itself, right? Which is where there's an abnormal and disproportionate concentration of power. And it's initially it was meant to be a constitutional court. So just to understand the Supreme Court, and we'll do this maybe in a different episode itself, but there was a federal court between 1935 to 49, and then the Supreme Court comes in, right? For in the federal court, I think roughly the numbers were for every 100 cases that were filed in the federal court, they only took up 4 or 5. So the 95 were confirmed, saying that no, whatever the High Court has said is correct. But now, there's a much greater number of cases that the Supreme Court takes on to itself. So therefore, there is a delay in that sense. Coming back to what Mitali asked, which is this sort of narrative that BJP or other even political parties try to set whenever there is a series of judgments or orders that don't go in their favor. They start talking about judicial reforms and how judiciary needs to be overhauled or changed or modernized and so on. There is some element of truth to it, but it should not be a seasonal request. It should not be only when things are not going my way, right? I believe, for example, that overhauling judiciary is important. We need to stay modern. We need to stay, light on our feet. Our judicial capacity must be international, global standards. So therefore, I also have a serious problem with how judges are appointed. The system of collegium is something, actually, if you remember in 2013, the entire parliament, actually all, 543 in Lok Sabha and in Raj Sabha 249. So only one person opposed it, which is Ramjit Malani. Everybody else except one MP voted in favor of a National Judicial Accountability Commission. So saying that there should be judges, but also there should be some representative from the government, opposition, civil society, all of them together choose judges, right? At the moment, what's happened also in just to talk about judicial appointments is only judges are appointing judges. So really, it's also becoming a place where a lot of people who are related to judges or known to judges are being appointed. So it's not truly representative of the diversity in our society. This Today, I think there are 3 women out of 31 Supreme Court judges, which is ridiculous. I mean, even at the High Court level, I know the Madras High Court probably has about, say, 15 out of 60. So it's slightly better, but again, nowhere close to 33, 60, 50%. But then equally in Parliament, it's 12%, right? So all of these places need to be reformed. So I'm a supporter of reforms, but not when it happens, only when things are not going in my favor.
Mitali, I want to talk about the morale of journalists from an Indian perspective. Obviously, we talk about the wave around, how spends affect what journalists do and so on. But these kind of things, like how do you think about it in the context of journalists feeling more confident about reporting?
I think there's two clear divisions. First of all, Ruchir, in terms of what's happening with a lot of the large mainstream journalists. I'm not saying they all think necessarily the same way, but I do think they are under much more pressure to take a particular line, and that in itself is quite stifling and harming, I think, for journalism. On that side, as you've seen in the trend of the recent reportage, it seems to be quite one sided. It seems not to ask critical questions. No one is saying, look, journalism is a political beast. You have, it is a political leaning. You can't be apolitical by being a journalist. So there are certain underlying philosophies there, but that doesn't stop you from asking critical questions. And I'm still to see an interview with the Prime Minister that has asked him about unemployment, food inflation, Manipur, China, you name it. I literally have not seen it. On the other side, Ruchir, I would say it's extremely damaging, and that's the honest truth. And it's damaging not so much for people like Prabir or even me who have sort of, our time is done. It's really, really scary for young journalists who try to take on journalism and attempt critical coverage and then find their offices, and in some cases, like in NewsClick, your home raided. It's not a high paying profession, especially not digital media. So what are you in it for when the after effects of that could be a loss of job, could be harassment, could be potential jail. So I think it's a really scary time for young journalists, and it's not easy to make these decisions because you could be in a large mainstream organization, but you could feel completely compromised for the work that you're doing.
I think it's on that very sort of sobering but very sort of practical note. We should reflect upon some interesting tidbits and stories that we've come across over the last week or that we want to share. So that's our section. Have you heard? So let's start with Ruchir first, and then Mitali, and then I. So, Ruchir, what have you heard, seen, understood over the last week that you want to share with us?
I want to talk about a sports person, an incredible sports person India has produced, one of the best. He's a Padma Shri. He's been representing India for 19 years, but he's not in a sport you think. He plays football. Sunil Chetri, who for a few years in between was the highest international scorer internationally in any
Hmm.
international games around the world. Like people think, oh, it might be Lionel Messi, it might be Cristiano Ronaldo. No, it was Sunil Chetri. I think right now he is the third highest scorer of international goals among active footballers anywhere in the world.
Hmm.
After Messi and Ronaldo, he's taken us to some really strong heights: Asian Football Confederation, the South Asian Football Federation Championship. So it's really sad to have some like an amazing footballer like this retire. I sometimes wonder, what could have been if he was born in a different country where soccer was taken more seriously. So it's a slightly sad day for Indian sport, but what an incredible achievement.
Fantastic. Couldn't agree more. So nice little shout out to Sunil Chetri, and hopefully he continues to stay in the system and gives back, through coaching and other such means. So on that, shall we move to Mitali for your have you heard?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to say, I think I look forward to this, and I hope people who listen to us do as well. It's relief from what can sometimes be pretty heavy conversations. So I was in London on work, and this is just happenstance that I happened to see an exhibition around Mount Everest, and I wanted to go in and just explore. And interestingly, this particular exhibition around Mount Everest was documenting 1921, where there was a British contingent that attempted to climb the Everest, and there were two really famous and well-known sort of climbers, George Leigh Mallory and Andrew Irwin. Um, and this was interesting for two reasons. One, because of just seeing the kind of rudimentary equipment they had. I mean, I was just thinking how cold it would have been, and to insulate themselves from that. And I was fascinated to read that this was the first time that they attempted to use oxygen apparatus, which a lot of people mocked them for, and they called, the locals of course called it English air, but people said, what's the point of this? But it was the first time that they attempted to use oxygen bottles to assist them while breathing in the thin air. Most unfortunately, one of their colleagues found that the day they were going to make their last attempt at the summit and climb, a lot of the equipment was lying in a very haphazard manner. So maybe they started climbing later than they had planned, uh, and they were never found. So no one knows whether they actually made it to the top, or whether they failed in their attempt because there was a massive sort of snowstorm that came in. I felt a bit sad to see some of the letters that, where they wrote back to their family, but I was fascinated to read about how, the first attempts of using oxygen while climbing a mountain happened. And amusing because only last week somebody tweeted a picture of like a literal human traffic jam at base camp, where they were like, people, you're like, folks, good luck, but take it easy, like, look how much life has changed, where there's literally a line of people to climb Mount Everest, and there you had this situation where people just disappeared. That's
I,
me.
I, I'm going to pick up on that thread, Mitali, how much
Yeah.
life has changed to talk about a book. I also wanted to sort of acknowledge, like a couple of weeks ago, I'd spoken about Sapiens, which tries to give us a maybe a deeper understanding of the past and the different factors that have shaped human civilization. A similar sort of attempt, but this book I found a little while before Sapiens, but I never got to reading it until recently. It's called From Volga to Ganga, but that's the English version. In Hindi it is Volga se Ganga, written by Rahul Sankrit Yayan. Very interesting. It is a collection of around 20 stories. So this is fiction, whereas Sapiens is completely non-fiction. But through these 20 stories, Rahul tries to tell us the sort of the course of Indo Gangetic Plain civilization from roughly 6000 BC till about 1920 or 1930 AD when he wrote it. So almost till the start of Second World War, like around maybe 1940. So really interesting. The reason I picked this book up again is after reading Sapiens, I wanted to get back to this book to sort of see the similarities. And again, I don't know how many people in India know about this. This is a fantastic and fascinating book about the history of human civilization. We speak so much about Sapiens. I think this is something anybody who reads will find very, very pleasantly surprised that an Indian wrote this in 1930 or 1940, and really interesting approach to speaking and writing about history of human civilization. So those are the have you heards for this week. So thank you very much. Richard, do you want to wrap up the podcast?
That's the end of episode
Close only
16.
after an hour.
We're ready to go to bed. Thank you for listening. It's been fun chatting, although sometimes depressing. We're grateful that you listen to us. Thank you. Please send in your feedback. We do read it. We're always grateful for encouragement or negative feedback. Let us know. We are at indiadialoguepodcast@gmail.com. Our Twitter handle is TID_podcast, TID being the India Dialogue, TID_podcast. On YouTube, we are at India Dialogue Podcast. Mitali is at Mitali Live, Manu at Manuraj1983. I am at Ruchir_P. Thank you again, and we look forward to talking to you next week. Bye.